Today we're making a wood-fired Korean barbecue table. It's a simple concrete design that fits around an off-the-shelf solo stove. It works extraordinarily well, and I really like that there's no gas or tanks of propane involved. Solo Stove isn't a sponsor, but they did send me this really nice Bonfire 2.0 fire pit. It's about 20 inches in diameter, so I'm going to start by cutting two circles of plywood 24 inches in diameter. This way there's a bit of an air gap between the stainless steel and the concrete. Ryobi makes a really good jigsaw, and if you can draw a circle, you can cut a circle. The key is just to go slow and keep your eye on the line. I screwed these two 3/4 inch thick plywood circles together, and then I took some vinyl baseboard trim and screwed it around the perimeter. It's a low-cost, flexible material that is great for reusable concrete molds. For the bottoms and sides of the molds, I'm just using melamine cut with my circular saw. I want a thickness of about 2.5 inches for the tabletop. That's plenty strong and hopefully won't be too heavy. Over the years I've found that for shallow concrete molds, hot glue is usually enough. I just run a bead the full length on all the outside seams. Although I had to do some inside seams for the center divider. I decided to do the top in two pieces just because I'm getting too old to move a 300-pound piece of concrete. I then took silicone caulk and sealed all the inside seams of the mold, and I just went right over the hot glue on the center divider. I don't use rebar in my concrete furniture projects too often, but it is kind of thin right around the circle. So I cut some rebar and wired it together so I'd have at least 2 strands of rebar reinforcing the thin concrete parts. I'm using Quikrete 5000 for the concrete mix. It's an off-the-shelf product that's at most Home Depots. It's inexpensive, it's stronger than typical concrete, and it has a nice gray color. I mixed it until it was the consistency of lumpy oatmeal, and then just scooped it right into the molds using a hoe to kind of level it out and push it down to get out the majority of the air bubbles. I pushed the rebar in just about 1 inch from the top of the mold. The top of the mold here will end up being the bottom of the tabletop, so I don't need to do too much troweling. I just used a putty knife and kind of smoothed everything out. This kind of concrete work is very DIY friendly. The one exception might be using an angle grinder to cut rebar, but you can use reinforcing mesh and cut it with wire cutters instead. For the table's vertical supports, I'm just making a melamine box. I really like using the Kreg jig for bigger, deeper concrete molds. I just find that pocket holes hold up really well when there's inside pressure on a box. If you're by yourself, cutting spacers and using corner clamps, and also long clamps that you can squeeze with one hand, make this assembly process a lot easier. I made the box just about 10 or 11 inches deep, hot glued the outside, and then siliconed the inside. Hot glue is definitely enough for the shallow tabletops, but I could have a big mess on my hand if I just hot glued a mold this deep and it all came apart with wet concrete in it. Now these giant bricks are going to be pretty heavy, so I cut up some styrofoam and duct taped it to a couple strips of wood. The styrofoam will want to float in the wet concrete, so the strips of wood allow me to screw it down to the top of the mold and hold it in place. For big projects like this, I don't mind a few air bubbles in the concrete. A few bubbles keeps the concrete looking like real concrete instead of a rendering of concrete. But if you want to get rid of the bubbles, you can use a reciprocating saw or a hammer drill to vibrate out a lot of them. I let the concrete cure for 48 hours before stripping away the mold. These pieces are pretty thick, so I'm not worried about chipping or breaking the concrete, although that would be a concern if the pieces were only about 1.5 inches to 1 inch thick. I like to use an old chisel to kind of scrape away the hot glue, which peels away in strips, and then I can hammer that chisel underneath the strips of melamine and pry them up. I was rushing a bit here, so I broke some of the strips of melamine, but in general, if you're careful, you can scrape away the hot glue, remove the pieces, and then scrape off any silicone with a chisel. And I'm typically able to reuse melamine pieces 6 to 8 times. Concrete doesn't stick to melamine, but it does create a bit of a suction. So it takes a little bit of effort to pry the pieces apart, but once you get them moving, each one of these 140-pound slabs is not too hard to handle. The side pieces weigh about 160 pounds each, and none of it was that hard to move with a dolly. Although you do want to be super mindful of your fingers when you're moving these pieces around and then setting them down flat onto concrete. The solo stove fits right in, and there's a nice 2-inch air gap in between the stainless steel and the concrete. My brother Nate had been watching me do a lot of power carving and he wanted to give it a try, so he carved us these little seats. I did buy the grilling attachment for the solo stove. It has this ring that you can flip, which serves as a riser for the cast iron grill. The cast iron grill is really heavy duty, and I like that you can still easily slide in logs right underneath it. While we were waiting for the fire to burn down to coals, we checked all the surfaces, and nothing was getting that hot. I am not Korean, so don't expect too much authenticity from the cuisine. But as someone who grew up in Southern California with a lot of Korean friends, here is our Maker Ranch version of it. It doesn't take that long for the grill to heat up, but I do recommend getting the fire started early so that the smoke dies down and you just got hot coals. That's a very satisfying sizzle. I like social gatherings and dinner parties that don't result in too many dishes. So I was really pleased to see that the grill was hot enough to quickly cook the meat, but not so hot that we felt like our faces were melting. We didn't even need to use tongs. We could do all the meat flipping with extra pair of chopsticks that stays in the raw meat bin. The design of the solo stove, and check out their website and information for details, does a really good job of managing the smoke. Doesn't get rid of all of it, but it's way better than just an open fire. We only needed about 3 to 4 small pieces of hickory to cook the entire meal, and cooking on real wood tastes a lot better than propane. Have you ever smelled propane? Kind of smells like farts. This is one of the first additions to Maker Ranch 2.0. I have a feeling this is going to get a lot of use. It also just works really well as a fire pit and outdoor coffee table.